Welcome friends to another r/NuclearRevenge video. Today we've got a crazy story of revenge against an awful boss. Our story of the day is giving my boss a taste of his own medicine. My boss was the complete package when it came to horrible bosses. He was stupid, lazy, selfish, condescending, uncaring, out of touch, and ambitious. I worked for a large enterprise management solutions company in their payroll section. I specifically dealt with handling queries for our high-end customers and training new consultants. I also handled challenging queries that our low and mid-tier consultants couldn't solve. I'm not a computer genius or an IT savant. I know how to do two things: read and search. When I started out as a consultant guy, the guy who trained me said this: "If you know how to read, you'll succeed in this job." I believed him and I came across a problem that wasn't covered in our training. I followed the query line back to its source, searched the database for the solution, and implemented it. That is literally what got me promoted to a senior consultant position in 2 years. A year later, I was dealing with our premium client accounts and handling training. The guy who trained me quit without saying a word, and at the time I didn't understand why. It didn't take long before I was also ready to quit, but I stuck it out because I needed the job. The problem with working in a big company is that everything is compartmentalized. So when something goes wrong, it can take a while for a request to work its way through the chain and then come back with a solution. This was especially true when it came to in-house IT problems. If something goes wrong with a client's system on payday, and at the same time we have an issue with our internet, phone lines, or computers, we were screwed. In the few times that it did happen when I was a consultant, I jumped in with my little IT knowledge and helped patch things until the work was done, and then got out of the way when IT arrived. When the pandemic hit, we were one of the first companies to start working from home. This meant that a lot of people suddenly had to take care of their IT problems themselves. My boss was one of those people. Ever since he learned that I have some minor experience in working with computers, he stopped calling IT altogether when his internet or system wasn't working. He called me. So at the start of us working for him, he had me come to his house to set up his Wi-Fi and workstation. When I suggested that he ask the company IT crew to do it, he said they'd take too long and we can't keep our premium clients waiting. I had to catch a bus and an Uber to get to his house. When I gave him the receipts to reimburse me, he told me to file it with the accounts department as an expense. So I did. They told me that I wasn't eligible to receive the reimbursement because it wasn't an expense related to my job. After arguing with HR for 3 weeks, they eventually took it out of the department's budget. My boss was furious with me even after I explained that it was actually his expense. He said that I shouldn't be so petty about such little money. Now, he had found a soulmate in his wife because she was him in a cheap weave and bad makeup. Their house was outside of town in the really nice suburbs, which is why I needed to take a bus and an Uber. They had really weird tastes. Their house and cars were expensive, but their electronics and furniture were cheap. Their clothes and jewelry were knockoffs, but their booze was top shelf. What didn't make sense was they were actually loaded, so they didn't need to skimp on things the way they did. He was making a very goodly amount of money from being the department head of consultants, and she made more than he did. She kept telling me, while I was installing his systems, that the reason I was doing the kind of work I had for the little money I was getting was because I was lazy and didn't go to college. She went on about how she went to a top-class school and worked hard, which is why she had a job at a very impressive company. I knew she was probably telling the truth about her salary because her company was one of our premium clients. And I've seen their payroll. Their people were getting paid. But money doesn't buy common sense because these people didn't even know how to set up their own Wi-Fi. I had to create their router's name and password after having set up everything else for him to work from home. He even had his email, username, and password written on a sticky note that he pasted on his screen. Honestly, I wasn't sure if not going into the office was going to be a good thing or a bad thing, because as incompetent as he was in the office, I didn't know if him not being around would make things worse. There was an incident before all this started when the government declared that there would be an extra public holiday the following week. This is a payroll nightmare. Payroll systems are designed to be robust so that clients can't just change things on their end and accidentally wipe out their entire database. So if something like a public holiday is declared and it wasn't scheduled into the system at the beginning of the new year, or at the very least the start of the new month, it creates problems. There's a whole heap of things that must be adjusted, like minimum weekly hours, taxes, work days for the year, and a bunch of other things. We can't just add an extra vacation day because that would mess up other things as well. So we had to go through every client account and manually change their calendars to count that day as a public holiday, and then manually adjust all their other metrics so that it wouldn't take people's vacation days or log them as absent without leave and then deduct a full day's pay at the end of the month. It was a week from heck. We had to stay late to get through all the client accounts before the public holiday. It was all hands on deck. Even my boss, who was out of the office 2 hours before we clocked out, couldn't hide and had to stay late with us. People were stressed, things were tense, and we were living off of coffee for those 6 days. On the second to last day, we were still not done, and people were starting to get sloppy because they were tired and worn out. Mistakes were being made and fixing them took time, which meant we were falling behind and everyone was starting to get on edge. My boss didn't help matters by exploding every time someone made a mistake or didn't complete their assigned client by his arbitrary deadlines, and then it happened. It was around 9 p.m. when one of the girls in the office, who was of a more timid nature, went to make a fresh pot of coffee. She was having a tough time, and my boss was taking his frustration out on her a lot. She was shaking so badly when she tried to make the coffee that she dropped the pot and it shattered at her feet. The sound of breaking glass gave her such a fright that she tried to run away, but slipped on the wet floor and sliced open her arm on the broken shards. This is where things get wild. My boss refused to allow her to leave to go to the hospital. He said it was her own clumsiness that caused her to get hurt, and that her going to the hospital would just delay things further. I'll confess that I wasn't one of the brave men who stood up to him that night, but a few of the guys were ready to send him to the hospital if he got in their way trying to take her to the hospital. The man saw wisdom and backed down. 3 people left to go to the hospital: the girl herself, her friend, and one of the guys who drove them there. We were now down 3 people and still behind schedule. I pretty much slept in that office those last 36 hours to get everything done on time. And what did we get in return? A "well done, team," while the boss got a performance bonus. This was the beginning of the end for our department. People were not happy as it were, and while the public holiday incident was bad, working from home sent them over the edge. When a query comes into a consultant's terminal, the system starts tracking what they do, how long they take to solve the ticket, and a bunch of other metrics. If they can't handle it, they must request the query to be transferred to a senior. The system then removes the ticket from them and puts it in the section leader's inbox. The system logs this as a failure on the part of the consultant who sent it up the chain. When we were still in the office, if someone had a difficult query, they'd either ask the person next to them for help or even the section leader. Whoever helped them would walk them through it in their terminal, so it still counted as their successful query. We did this for morale as well as training, because once you see how it's done, you gain experience and you keep your job. Obviously, if people try to game it and be lazy, we just left them to drown. Once we started working from home, we couldn't do that anymore, so section leaders requested the login details of their team so they could log in live to the other person's terminal and help them out. When my boss found out that that's what we're doing, he requested everyone's login details from IT and started spying on us while we worked. The senior consultants got sick of his attitude and behavior, as well as his poor management of the department. They started quitting. I ended up being the one who processed them all out. The reason was that my boss didn't know the procedure for when someone leaves the department. Even though it wasn't my job, I had to look up what needed to happen so that nothing fell through the cracks. I had to get people's laptops and screens that they set up in their homes, which then had to be processed by IT. I had to fill out access revocation forms so that IT could remove their login privileges from the remote network. I also needed to inform HR so that they could do the last day calculations and inform the state how the person's employment ended. If you quit as opposed to being fired, you can't claim unemployment from the state, and a lot of people didn't know that. So when they came back to us to complain, my boss sent them to me and all I could do was refer them to HR. That didn't mean that I didn't have people swearing and crying in my office 6 weeks after they quit because they couldn't buy food. Of course, with more and more people quitting, we weren't able to handle all the client queries, and that meant we needed to move people up from the lower tier consulting floors to help handle the load. And since the lower tiers were losing people, they had to do a recruitment drive, which meant that I had to do more training. But because the guys were pulled up to the premium client level too soon, they didn't have enough experience, so I had even more internal queries to deal with from my own people. At this point, it was my job to train new employees, train old employees, process people out who quit, handle internal queries, and handle external queries. But that was just the beginning of my woes. One premium tier consultant is worth 3 or 4 mid or lower tier consultants. The reason is that at the lower tiers, they can do the work of 3 or 4 mid or lower tier consultants. And the time it takes a mid-tier consultant to handle one case, they could handle 3 or 4 such cases. So at the lower tiers, these top tier guys could handle 15 to 20 cases a day. And then with the premium clients, they'd handle 4 or 5 a day because those cases were more complicated. When the lower tier consultants were brought up from their 4 or 5 mid-tier cases a day to the top tier, they were only managing 1 or 2 a day. So for us to handle the workload of the premium clients, we almost had to strip the mid-tier bare. That meant that we had to recruit an almost entirely new department of rookies. My boss said no. To recruit that many people would destroy his budget, and bye-bye performance bonus. Because he was sitting at home, he didn't see how bad the situation was. We basically had to fill the positions with 1/3 of what we needed. So what did that mean? Any query that couldn't be handled within 30 minutes was sent up to the team leader. If they couldn't solve it quickly, it went up to the next consulting tier, and so on until it landed in my inbox. And it was right around this time when my boss decided to make my life miserable. Part of his job was to sit in on meetings with potential new premium clients. Because the CEO wanted the client to see who the people were that would be handling their payroll, my boss's role was to assure the client of the type of support they would receive. The problem was that the payroll systems that also ensure statutory compliance are constantly updated and changed. So if you're not working with the system on a regular basis, you get left behind on what it can and can't do. Since he hadn't worked on any queries in years, he had no idea what we could and couldn't do on support anymore. He started making promises to clients about support services we either didn't provide anymore or simply weren't possible on our system. One of these promises involved telling a client that they could instantly access their historic payroll data on their end. We'd not been doing that for almost a year. While I didn't agree with it, the development team decided that in order to make the software boot and run faster, the previous month's payroll data would be automatically wiped and placed in an off-network archive. This didn't mean that the data was irretrievable, it was just a tedious process of getting it back. The new client went ahead and signed a contract, and we began the process of changing them over to our system. This means installing the software on their systems and training their staff in HR on how to use the software. In a company their size, this process usually takes about 2 weeks to get all the computers updated and all the staff trained in how to log their hours, leave, disbursements, etc. Everything went well and all looked good until the second week of the month came. The biggest part of why this company chose to go with us was because we promised them that our system allows them instant access to past payroll on their end. The reason they needed it was because they had employees who worked on sites that didn't have internet, fax, or printing facilities, but were generating disbursements on site. So whenever they came back to the office 2 or 3 weeks later, they'd scan all their receipts and then claim the expenses back. But if they generated the expense in the 3rd or 4th week of the month, they'd usually only make the claim in the 2nd or 3rd week of the next month. But for tax purposes, the expense and benefit was accrued in the previous month and had to be logged then, even though the cash payment was made in the next month. You can imagine my confusion when this query popped up on my screen. I spent nearly 2 hours on the phone speaking to everyone, from the payroll person to the CEO, explaining that what they wanted to do was not possible, and the only way to get what they wanted was to retrieve it from the archive. Eventually, it came out that my boss told them that they would have instant access. When I brought this up with him, he first denied that he said that, until they produced the meeting minutes, and then he said it was my fault. Apparently, I told him that we still provide that service, and he went on my word and told the client. That was the last straw for me, and I started keeping a record of the things he was doing and had done before. So now, on the 1st of every month, I had to do an archive retrieval and then update the client's payroll database. It was bad enough that it was a tedious process, but what made it worse was that you could only retrieve 1 month at a time. So on a third month, I had to do 2 retrievals and updates, on the 4th, 3, and on the 5th, 4, and so on. After 6 months, the issue the devs were trying to avoid was wreaking havoc on the client's systems. 6 months of payroll data stored locally on the client system was slowing it down to Internet Explorer speeds. The client fired us. My boss got chewed out by the CEO, and all that crap rolled downhill onto my head. I had been waiting for this day. The moment our virtual meeting started, I started a screen capture recording. I went through the entire list of things he'd done since I started working with him, and how the state of the department was entirely his fault, along with the loss of the premium client. He started telling me how someone like me could never understand the responsibilities of leadership because I was uneducated and that this was the highest I'll ever rise in life, and that my ungratefulness and lack of respect cost me my job because he was going to get me fired first thing in the morning. That was all I needed to hear. I said, "In that case, this meeting is over." I shut down the meeting, logged out of my terminal, saved the recording, turned off my laptop, and waited. A few hours later, I left my apartment to catch a bus. I paid cash for the bus and got off where I caught my Uber the last time I went to my boss's house. This time I didn't call an Uber, I walked. It took me almost 2 hours to get there, and it was freezing outside. It was near midnight when I got there, so the street was empty. I saw that both of their cars were in the driveway, so I knew they were home. I crept into his backyard and sat down near the wall where I installed the Wi-Fi router. I took out my laptop and logged into my terminal through their Wi-Fi. Now here is something most of you won't know about payroll consultants. We can change your salaries from our terminals. That's right. As long as a company uses our software, any consultant with the right privileges can change anyone's salary. And of course, we would use our own product, so I accessed our employees' salaries through my terminal and tripled my salary for that month. Once it was done, I shut down my laptop, sneaked out, and began my long journey home. It was almost dawn when I got home, and work started in 3 hours, but I took a nap because I wanted to be somewhat alert for what I knew was going to be a rough day. First thing I did when I woke up was tell HR that my boss said he was going to get me fired. HR said that my boss had already filed a complaint for insubordination the previous day, and that if I wanted to file a complaint, I was welcome to do so. Because of all of the out-processing of the other employees I'd been doing, I familiarized myself quite well with the company's disciplinary procedure. I knew that if I filed a separate complaint, I wouldn't be allowed to bring up anything in his complaint against me from my own complaint. So I waited for them to serve me with the notice for a disciplinary hearing, and then I filed a counter-complaint. The counter-complaint had all the evidence I'd put together against him. Everything from the public holiday incident, the snooping on employees, and the snafu with the premium client. This process took a few weeks of pushing papers back and forth before an actual hearing was scheduled. In the meantime, my salary was paid out. I, being a good employee, immediately ran to HR to tell them there was a mistake and asked them how I could refund the extra money that was paid to me. I kicked a hornet's nest that day because everyone was running around trying to figure out how this happened. Eventually, they did an IT audit and it came back to my username and login. So it was clear that I was the one who increased my own salary. This was rolled into my ongoing disciplinary hearing, which now became one of insubordination and theft. An outside attorney chaired the hearing, and the HR manager represented the company against me. During the hearing, the audit was used as evidence against me, and I, of course, denied it, saying that it doesn't make sense for me to increase my salary only to turn myself in. HR argued that I had a change of heart and tried to make it seem like I was innocent by reporting it first. When the IT manager had to testify about how he compiled the report and the evidence in the report, that's when I pulled my rabbit from the hat. I asked him how he knew it was me, and he said because my username and password were used to access the terminal. I then asked if I was the only one who had access to my username and password. He, of course, said no, because he was the one who gave my boss the list of everyone's username and password. My next question was, how do we know it wasn't him who logged into my account to change my salary? He sat there for a few seconds and then pulled out his laptop. After about 5 minutes, he turned the screen around and said, "It wasn't me." On the screen were all of the logins into my terminal, and while most of them came from the same IP address, a few a week came from a different address. He then changed the screen to show that the IP address in question logged into multiple terminals every week. But the first terminal it logged into and most frequently used was my boss's. And this is where I made my case. I argued that in his attempt to fire me, he tried to frame me by increasing my salary through my terminal, knowing that I would get caught, because he was afraid that I was going to expose his incompetence. Especially after he lost a big client for the company. Everything he said to try and make himself look innocent only made him look more guilty. The chairperson dismissed the case against me and found that my boss was constructively trying to get me to quit, as he had done with other employees. The company then filed a case against him for fraud, and he was found guilty and fired. I was promoted into his position, and immediately I reached out to the other consultants who had quit to try and save the department. Some of them got new jobs and others were glad to come back, knowing that the old boss was gone. The young lady who was cut couldn't face working in an office again, even though that other guy wasn't around anymore. I wish I would have done more to stand up for her, but all I can do now is help the ones in front of me. Personally, I feel like this goes without saying, but do you think OP was just a little bit insane? Going to the length of sneaking to their boss's house, logging into their terminal there, changing their salary, and then claiming that it was the boss trying to frame OP? Do you think OP is extremely lucky this didn't backfire on them somehow? Let me know down in the comments. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another crazy revenge story, make sure to hit that left video. Or if you missed my latest video, click on the right one. That said though, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.